have a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We're just wrapping up our 4th season, which is about schmecks on the internet, the symbiosis of humanity's 2 most basic instincts, innovation and getting off. We cover everything from Puritans to Tumblr to deepfakes. Go check it out. Last month, in an interview with the Times of London, Denis Villeneuve made a comment that had some people pretty upset. "Frankly, I hate dialogue," he said, going on to argue that dialogue is for theater and television, and that he isn't interested in dialogue because pure image and sound is the power of cinema, but it is something not obvious when you watch movies today. His comment was certainly misinterpreted online. Villeneuve wasn't saying that dialogue should never matter, he was just arguing on behalf of the visual language of cinema. After all, it's a visual medium. But any statement as general and harsh as "I hate dialogue" is sure to get you some heat. Especially if you're currently adapting one of the densest fantasy series of all time. I have a lot of appreciation for Villeneuve's visually arresting films, but his comment made me wonder if pure image and sound is always applicable. The comment was especially rolling around in my mind after I watched Anyone But You. Anyone But You had been highly anticipated as the movie that'll revive the recently deceased romantic comedy genre, and it's okay, but I felt like it was missing something. Immediately after Anyone But You, I watched 27 Dresses, that 2008 Anne Fletcher film starring Katherine Heigl and James Marsden, to affirm to myself that the rom-com was indeed worthy of resuscitating. And I am pleased to say that I was affirmed. But why? 27 Dresses isn't particularly visually striking. It was even panned by critics when it came out for being insipid, cliched, and cheap. But there had to be a reason other than blind nostalgia for why I enjoyed it so much watching it all these years later. The rom-com has been around for what feels like forever. In the midst of plague and religious persecution, Shakespeare was writing comedies like As You Like It, Twelfth Night, and Much Ado About Nothing, which are full of hijinks, convoluted plots, characters in disguise, puns, and, unlike his tragedies and histories, happy endings. These plays are often centered on a courtship between 2 lovers, so a happy ending for Shakespeare usually means marriage. A couple centuries later, during the Regency era, Jane Austen was writing her comedies of manners, like Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility, which also feature convoluted courtships as they intersect with class, wordplay, and a tone that was, in her words, light and bright and sparkling. They also place a greater focus on a wise but stubborn female heroine. Then, after film was invented in the height of the Great Depression, we got screwball comedies. These movies were about the hijinks that ensues when 2 very different people meet and fall in love. They responded to the tumult of their times by featuring class commentaries that often punch up at the rich, and because it was made under the enforcement of the Motion Picture Production Code, a big draw of the screwball was that it conveyed the sexual tension between characters by using clever banter.
Is there anything in the world that doesn't belong to you?
Yes, thank heaven, you!
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I might have known you were here. I had a feeling just as I hit the floor.
And the screwball heroine is, how do I put it, quirked up.
Oh, hello.
This is my car.
Oh, good. Then would you mind moving it out of the way?
Now look what you've done.
Oh, that's all right. I'm insured.
Won't you just take the olive dish?
No, it's all right. I'll sit here. You don't mind, do you?
Not at all.
George!
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 George! Oh, stop it, Susan. You sound like an echo.
But with the exception of sex comedies from the 50s and 60s, which bear more likeness to teen comedies like American Pie than to the rom-com as we know it, and Annie Hall, the only rom-com to be made during the New Hollywood era, which put a countercultural spin on the genre by ending with its 2 lovers breaking up rather than getting together, the rom-com in its traditional sense more or less died out until 1989 with the release of When Harry Met Sally. Directed by Rob Reiner and written by Nora Ephron, When Harry Met Sally is by all accounts reminiscent of Annie Hall. Like Annie Hall, it centers on a cynical Jewish man who meets a less cynical waspish woman. It's got quick and naturalistic dialogue, it's set in New York, and even the costuming is similar. And as Reiner had initially planned it, Harry, his surrogate character, and Sally, Ephron's surrogate, would drift apart and then run into each other years later on the street and discuss how much their lives had changed before walking away as the credits roll. Reiner conceived of the film during a long period of singleness after a major divorce from his wife Penny Marshall. But when he met his next wife during the making of When Harry Met Sally, he felt it deserved a happier ending. So instead, what we get is, yes, Harry and Sally dissolving their friendship and budding romance like Annie Hall. That is, until Harry has a come-to-Jesus moment and, in a grand gesture, runs all the way to a New Year's party to find Sally and confess his love to her in what is now one of the most famous monologues in film history. When Harry Met Sally is widely credited with kicking off the rom-com boom of the 90s and 2000s, but it's also accused of spawning what would very quickly become a tired formula in the genre. Man meets woman, they don't like each other but slowly fall in love. One of them wrongs the other and then must resolve the romance in a grand gesture in order to justify a happy ending that would make Shakespeare proud. Skeptics will say that 90s and 2000s rom-coms contain an unbearable lightness. They are overly materialistic, post-feminist, reinforcing of a patriarchal status quo, lacking the satire of a screwball and cynicism of Annie Hall, overwhelmingly white, and insufferably heterosexual. And yes, they are all of those things. The rom-com formula was relentlessly spoofed and deconstructed by the irony-poisoned culture of the 2010s, before dying off almost entirely, unless you count teen rom-coms like To All the Boys I've Loved Before, or the never-ending slew of made-for-TV Vanessa Hudgens films belched out by Netflix during the pandemic.
Nothing would make me happier. My handsome knight.
Fair maiden.
Or Crazy Rich Asians, which brought much-needed diversity to the genre, but is more of a comedy drama than a straight-up romantic comedy. That's why When Anyone But You was released this past December, which uses the traditional When Harry Met Sally formula, with the backdrop of a good old-fashioned rumored affair between its leads Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell, we went feral. Rom-coms were back, baby. But here's the thing. Anyone But You looks like When Harry Met Sally. It talks like When Harry Met Sally. Well, actually, it's based on Much Ado About Nothing, so it talks like Shakespeare. But it doesn't really feel like When Harry Met Sally, or really any of the rom-coms that I've come to love over the years. My friend Hannah has seen more rom-coms than anyone I know. She's witnessed more grand gestures and climactic speeches than she can count, and yet each time she watches that famous scene in When Harry Met Sally, she cries, and she doesn't know why. Well, the romantic comedy may be formulaic, but it is capable of being greater than the sum of its parts. Sure, When Harry Met Sally reinforces old-fashioned tropes about marriage. Sure, 27 Dresses is post-feminist and materialistic. But when it's great, it's so much more than that. And it's not because I'm nostalgic, and it's not because I want to see two hot people boinking. I come here today because when you realize you're in love with a genre every serious person hates, you need to make a bloated video essay defending it so you can prove Denis Villeneuve wrong. So put on your glasses and get out your x-rays, because today we're looking at the anatomy of the rom-com. At least, my favorite ones.
There's been a lot of bumps in the road. Oh yeah. Always carrying that oh so heavy load. When you feel like there's too much on your plate, just call on me.
In all honesty, as much as I appreciate its existence, Anyone But You is okay, veering into not great, and initial critical reaction seemed to agree. I think Benjamin Lee of The Guardian put it best. He said that the individual issues he took with the film were not exactly the root of its problem. The genre is not loved for its gritty realness, but there has to be something deeper, something to make us care for the will or won't of the formula. So it's missing that thing, that magical quality of older rom-coms that you really only come to appreciate in hindsight. What Anyone But You mostly just reveals is that, like any not great rom-com, you can use the formula, but it won't always work. So let's break down the components of a rom-com when it does work. What is that magical quality? Unfortunately, many of the mainstream rom-coms of the 90s and 2000s are extremely white. But there are some really fun BIPOC rom-coms from this time, like How Stella Got Her Groove Back and Love and Basketball, which you should definitely check out. But just keep in mind that the movies I'm talking about here are ones that are personal to me, because they're ones that I grew up with and have continued to watch as an adult. So if you don't see your favorite rom-com represented here, that is why. Let's begin. Something I really value in any movie, but especially the rom-com, is world building. I want to feel like our two lovers have rich, expansive lives that exist beyond the events of the film. This is best conveyed through their friendships and familial bonds. For example, in the 1994 Richard Curtis hit 4 Weddings and a Funeral, the romance between Charles and Carrie is equaled, if not maybe overpowered, by Charles's richly fleshed out friend group. Through the social events, you come to understand the dynamics of this group, and grow so close to them that when Gareth, who's often played for comedic relief, suddenly dies, the film is brought to a halt by the emotional impact of this moment. Critic Stephanie Zacharek criticized Richard Curtis on this basis, saying in her review of Notting Hill that his fallback is to take one confused central character, surround him with well-meaning friends who lavish him with advice, and make sure everyone is paired off happily by the end. But I think this is the major reason his films are so great.
And most of her limbs work, whereas I'm stuck in this thing day and night in a house full of ramps. And to add insult to serious injury, I've totally given up smoking.
In Notting Hill, the sweet but sad backstory given to Will's best friends Bella and Max is very realistically and subtly weaved into the film. In Bridget Jones, Bridget's friend group is hilarious, but with an authentically catty metropolitan sensibility. She calls them her urban family. You want to be friends with the protagonist's friends almost as much as you want to kiss their love interests. The friendships in these films let us peer inside the worlds of the leads when they're not pursuing romance. Harry and Sally both have established friend groups and distinct lifestyles that you really get a feel for throughout the film. Sally, uptight and financially stable, dines with her cosmopolitan and single friends at a chic restaurant in Central Park. Her friends are neurotic and unlucky in love, and so their terrible advice is what pushes her to ask Harry on a date when they first hang out, despite having disliked him for years. Harry relates to his equally cynical friend Jess through the very gendered activities of jogging, golfing, and ball games. When characters like Sally's redhead friend float in and out of the plot, it feels natural, like their lives are continuing off-screen. There's also a lot of texture given to Bridget's family life in Bridget Jones, both through the subplot of her parents' rocky marriage, which mirrors her own love life, and to the context through which she and Mark Darcy keep running into each other. The same can be said for 27 Dresses. Jane's family dynamic between her sister and her father is so real and painful, and provides a great emotional foundation for what is otherwise a very lighthearted story. Anyone But You also features friend and family dynamics, but the supporting characters feel a bit underwritten. We don't get a strong understanding of why Ben is so close with Pete's family, which sucks because the entire reason we're in Australia is for the wedding of two people we don't know or care about, a far cry from 4 Weddings and a Funeral. Hallie especially suffers for this. Rather than getting a scene that sets the foundation of her and Bee's dynamic, she's introduced in a group moment and never really revisited in depth. I would have liked to see her go rightfully berserk at her sister for undermining every step of their wedding. And now I'm going to say something that might be shocking to hear coming from me. A major component of world building in a rom-com is the vibes. Not so much the visuals like Denis Villeneuve is saying, but the atmosphere, the costumes, the settings, the music, the kitchens. The goal here is to curate such wonderful vibes that your brain is given permission to go on autopilot without being pulled out of the world of the film. These movies tend to feature really cozy blues and Motown soundtracks that give them a bit of sensuality and timelessness. As a sympathizer of 1980s fashion, I absolutely love the costuming in When Harry Met Sally. Sally's oversized androgynous trousers and blazers and big 80s hair, paired with Harry's cable knit sweaters and running shoes, are just so stylish. So much so that both of their wardrobes have inspired TikTok trends. And the New York setting, while certainly whitewashed and conspicuously free of the decade's urban decay, is very iconic, especially the fall leaves in Central Park and the recurring motif of Washington Square Park. Their apartments are also lived in, but aspirational. Bridget Jones, on the other hand, cultivates a really quaint atmosphere. Her apartment has that controlled chaos kind of beauty to it, and her costuming in the film has recently come to be defined as the frazzled Englishwoman aesthetic, which I definitely channel on my bad days. Conversely, Jules in My Best Friend's Wedding is the cool girl to Cameron Diaz's girlier girl, so her relaxed outfits are more evocative of Sally than Bridget, and play into that late 90s minimalism that I love so much. Nancy Meyers, the creator of the most financially successful rom-coms in film history, has become synonymous with the beautiful homes of her characters, particularly their kitchens. Half the reason I fell in love with The Holiday is because of the gorgeous, bespoke English countryside homes of Graham and Iris. Meyers has actually taken issue with the general discourse around the aesthetics of these films because, for her, it's not only about aesthetics, it's to breathe life into the story and denote specific things about the character. Their homes are beautiful but eclectic to signal greater themes in the film. As Nora Ephron puts it, love is a kind of homesickness. We tend to fall in love with people or apartments who remind us of something familiar. The vibe of the picturesque settings and stylish costuming in great rom-coms is both aspirational and comforting. While the soundtrack is nice, I found the atmosphere of Anyone But You to have a bit of a commercial gloss to it that personally wasn't very appealing to me. I prefer my rom-coms to be quaint, which the beachy Sydney setting just couldn't give me, and it was hard to get an idea of who the already underwritten characters are because for the entire movie they're staying in a kind of hideous Airbnb. And while Sydney Sweeney looked gorgeous, her styling felt less aspirational or trend-setting than it was dated. Another very important facet of a rom-com is chemistry between the two lovers. Do we buy the romance? I think the appeal of that final romantic gesture that this formula has beaten to death is the idea of inconveniencing yourself for love, taking a risk. And in order to get behind this risk as a viewer, you have to understand the chemistry developing in front of you. In the screwball tradition, rom-coms don't usually just show people boinking. It's more so about coding this tension. As Brian Henderson writes about this format, it implies a process of perpetual displacement, of euphemism and indirection at all levels, a latticework of disassembling and hiding laid over what is constantly present but denied, unspoken, unshown. We perceive the sublimation system and the thing itself at every point, a system of repression suffused with a libidinal glow. What makes the romance so believable in When Harry Met Sally is the friendship they develop throughout the film. Some may say the final grand gesture feels contrived because of Harry's sudden turn of heart about commitment, considering he spent the entire movie not outwardly returning Sally's affections.
Oh, I think it's great that you have a date.
You do?
Yeah.
But you can see his fondness for her shining through in tiny moments just by the look on his face. The same goes for Sally, whose looks of disappointment begin early on whenever Harry mentions sleeping with other people. They clearly have a great deal of respect for each other, so when he ghosts her after their first reunion, you feel angry at him right along with her. Their romance is a slow burn, which makes his final speech so amazing. Whenever Sally says this,
"Anyway, it's about old friends,"
it gets to me every time. While Bridget doesn't end up with Daniel and Bridget Jones, much of the film's running time is dedicated to their courtship, and the tension between them is palpable. Daniel's yearning for Bridget through long glances in the office leaves you a bit giddy, and like the screwball, their chemistry is conveyed mostly through repartee.
Well, I thought it might be a charitable thing to take your skirt out for dinner and try and fatten it up a bit. Maybe you could come too.
On the flip side, she and Mark's romance has a schoolyard sweetness to it. It's like a growing crush they're both too embarrassed to admit to. The eventual revelation of his feelings is one of the only times I think the When Harry Met Sally speech is done well. I'll get to why that is a bit later. Mark also takes a great risk by leaving his job offer in New York and flying back to profess his love without ever knowing if Bridget will still be there waiting for him. And while critics didn't like 27 Dresses, I think what gives it longevity is the magnetic attraction between Jane and Kevin. Kevin's negging of her throughout the movie is honestly very sexy, and whenever he looks at her, he does it with so much befuddled admiration. So when they eventually hook up in the car, you're cheering them on. You also wish you were in that car instead. In Anyone But You, the romance between Bea and Ben develops quickly and unevenly. Their earliest meeting is shown mostly through montage, so we don't really come to feel the connection. Ben's anger about Bea leaving in the morning is over the top.
I couldn't get her out of here fast enough. This girl's a disaster. She's a nothing.
And this miscommunication is also very contrived and definitely can't justify the next hour and a half and 2 years in film time they spend despising each other. Their fallout near the end is also very bizarre. Bea is mad at Ben for telling her parents that she dropped out of law school, except he didn't. He told his close friend Pete. She then apologizes for knocking over the cake and ruining her sister's wedding, except she didn't. The dog did. Generally, it's just difficult to buy Ben's grand gesture at the end when the stakes feel quite low and last only about a scene and a half. Chemistry also comes hand in hand with charisma, or the personas of the two lead actors. Annie Hall, after all, was written with the express intention of shining a light on Diane Keaton's eccentric personality.
La-di-da, la-di-da, la-la, yeah.
Which comes through again in Nancy Meyers' 2003 film Something's Gotta Give. Much of the enjoyment in watching that film stems from getting to see megastars Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson engage in slapstick geriatric sex. Bridget Jones's spinster characterization could easily be insulting, but Renee Zellweger makes her so likable. Bridget gets away with a lot of her blunders because she has this innate charm. Hugh Grant and Colin Firth's characters are informed by an audience awareness of who these men are. Hugh Grant plays against his usual bumbling soft boy type by turning into a suave womanizer. He's so good at it that it's easy to understand why someone would be duped into loving Daniel, which is what makes his betrayal of Bridget all the worse. Colin Firth, on the other hand, is as stiff as ever, but he brings with Mark Darcy a very welcome gentleness and stability after the ride that Daniel has taken us on. When Harry Met Sally is carried by the charisma of its stars, who actually weren't yet celebrities when they were cast. Meg Ryan is extremely beautiful, but has a girl next door sweetness to her, and she transports Sally from a girl who's initially taken aback by Harry's crudeness to understanding and even sometimes outsmarting him. And while Billy Crystal is not conventionally attractive, he uses his comedic background to imbue Harry with his own distinct spice. The character is so funny that you can't help but fall in love with him.
I would be proud to partake of your pecan pie.
Crying baby, kiss the baby.
Baby spitting up, exorcist baby.
Baby. Yes, sir, that's my baby.
No, sir, don't mean maybe.
And when the two of them are being silly and uninhibited with each other, you can read the tenderness in their eyes. I know that Sydney Sweeney and Glenn Powell allegedly had this steamy affair during filming, but somehow that isn't conveyed in the film. Their characters feel too generic and their star personas too underdeveloped to really come through here. I like Sydney Sweeney, but I'll be honest that I don't think rom-coms are the best fit for her talents. Her comedic timing is just a bit jumbled here.
No, thank you. I'm all good on creatine and smell insecurity.
Glenn Powell is definitely giving the character his most naturalistic effort, and it sometimes works, but ultimately his character and Sydney's are a bit too normie to feel charismatic. They're both conventionally uber attractive, and unlike a lot of other rom-com protagonists who work in somewhat creative fields, they work in law and finance, respectively. So it ends up feeling like watching Chad and Stacy from high school inevitably fall in love because they're both the hottest people in the room, rather than two people winning each other over with their charm. Over time, the heroine or female lead has become more and more integral to the rom-com. And this might be controversial, but for me, a great rom-com centers on a woman who is 30 or older. Someone whose fatigue and anxiety about dating is felt by the viewer. We need to know why she needs love. Moreover, in the Screwball and Annie Hall traditions, a great rom-com heroine is idiosyncratic, or quirked up if you will. She is a character who we can relate to, and who can entertain us for the duration of the film. Sally Albright and Bridget Jones are my favorite rom-com heroines, but for very different reasons. Sally has a sensibility very common within the American rom-com canon, which is ironically derived from Pride and Prejudice's Elizabeth Bennet. As Paula Morantz Cohen observes in What Have Clothes Got to Do with It? Romantic Comedy in the Female Gaze, one of Elizabeth's most salient traits is her cheerfulness. She was cheerful even as she faced a future of spinsterhood in the company of an impossibly enervating mother. For Cohen, as early as the Screwballs, the American rom-com heroines inspire viewers to approach life with liveliness and zest. And the person who really brought this into the contemporary era was Nora Ephron, who, after When Harry Met Sally, went on to direct some of the most successful rom-coms of the 90s. Ephron's heroines are typically characterized by their optimism, kindness, and empathy, foils to their cynical, downbeat romantic counterparts. As scholar Roberta Garrett describes it, Ephron allows the positive attributes associated with the heroine to shine through in her depiction of an often harsh and sexist world. So Sally is defined by her unbridled optimism, but what makes her stronger than the sometimes unbearably saccharine heroines of Ephron's other films is that this optimism is also a setback. Sally's desire to appear unbothered by her breakup places her in a state of denial that comes crashing down when she finds out that her ex is getting married to another woman. She may be pathologically organized and self-assured, but in the moment she cries about this revelation to Harry, hobbling around, snotting on his sweater, and hair permed to the point of caricature, she is deeply imperfect.
I'm difficult.
Challenging.
Her despair is resonant because we can understand her frustration, not just out of heartbreak and rejection, but out of the feeling that she's being aged out.
And it's not the same for men. Charlie Chaplin had babies when he was 73.
Yeah, but he was too old to pick them up.
Bridget Jones deals with the same conundrum, but quite differently. The character was conceived by writer Helen Fielding after she was asked by The Independent to write a column about being a woman in her 30s. The thing is, Helen is a bit of a cool girl, and so feeling that to do so would be, in her words, hopelessly embarrassing and revealing, she wrote it anonymously as a more heightened and ridiculous version of herself. Please do remember, she insisted, it wasn't me who drank all the alcohol units and shagged all the F-wits. It was Bridget Jones, obviously. And here we get Bridget, a jaded 32-year-old woman whose current fear is to be eaten by dogs when she inevitably dies sad and alone. Bridget is less polished than Sally. She's odd and incredibly awkward around most people.
Afraid I'm a bit hungover. Wish I could be lying with my head in the toilet like all normal people.
What do you think?
Do you know where the toilets are?
She's also never fully kept, even in her best moments. Many have fairly criticized Bridget Jones for suggesting that the averagely sized Renee Zellweger is fat, which is definitely ridiculous and indicative of the body standards of the time. But aside from this, Bridget is very much a mess. And unlike Sally and so many other rom-com heroines, romance is not the only part of life that she's lost in. Near the end of each film, both Sally and Bridget are delivered an impassioned speech by their two love interests. And what's remarkable about these speeches is that Harry and Mark don't list off the positive attributes of the heroines, they list off their shortcomings. The beauty of these speeches is that they let you feel like you don't have to check off every box to be appealing to someone. It's a depiction of love that's both realistic and ideal. To love someone not despite, but because of their flaws.
I like you.
Apart from the smoking and the drinking and the vulgar mother,
No, I like you very much. Just as you are.
Ben's speech in Anyone But You, on the other hand, falls flat because, well, what does he say he likes about her?
I love the way we fight. I love how smart you are. I love the weird way you stick your hands down my pants. And I love how you know what you don't want.
I love the way you have teeth and hair. I love that you wake up every day. And I love that you drink water. When Harry and Mark list off these traits, it emphasizes that they've been closely observing Sally and Bridget. Something that you do when you're infatuated with someone. But B, like every other character in Anyone But You, is generic. There are some half-hearted attempts to quirk her up a bit, but they feel forced and unspecific to who she is.
Nora.
When are you ever gonna learn?
From the jump, she's perfectly manicured, even after sleeping on Ben's couch. We also aren't given much insight into why she runs out that morning.
It was the first time in my life that I felt fire and I had to blow it out.
But why? When Ben says he knows exactly where B is when she walks off at the end, and it's the most famous monument in Australia, I had to laugh. Does he know B? Do we know B? It makes you realize that part of the reason we cry at Harry's speech is the same reason people cry at weddings. You've gotten to know two people intimately, so you experience catharsis when they get together. That's the power of specificity. I'm also sorry to say that, okay, I know I'm her age, but Sydney Sweeney is too young for me to relate to her as a rom-com heroine. Unlike Sally and Bridget, she hasn't endured a prolonged period of singleness. She actually just got out of a relationship. So while it would be nice for her and Ben to end up together, we don't really feel like they need to. Like any great movie, great rom-coms will build to a moment of poignancy that allows you to really feel for a character. A final straw. And when Harry met Sally, it's the crying scene.
But the truth is, you didn't want to marry me.
In Bridget Jones, it's when Daniel's mistress kicks Bridget while she's down.
I thought you said she was thin.
And the one that hits me the hardest is in 27 Dresses when, after watching Jane act as a selfless pincushion for her horrible sister Tess, the final boss of rom-com villains.
Pedro is my...
I'm his little brother.
From the Big Brother program at the Y.
Oh. Hola, Pedro!
She finds out that Tess has destroyed their late mother's wedding dress. It's devastating, and it makes you root for Jane even when she proceeds to sabotage the wedding. But because of its low-stakes conflict and generic heroine, we don't get this moment in Anyone But You. When Nancy Meyers made Something's Gotta Give, this was her reasoning. I have spent the last 2 decades not only being single, but writing a couple of movies about divorced women my age, purposely defying the cliches that being older and single meant you were destined to be undesirable, lonely, and isolated. I wrote about women in my films who blossomed post-divorce, much as I had done in some ways. Erica Berry, like other heroines of great rom-coms, doesn't attract the attention of Harry with pure sex appeal. She's in her 50s, successful, and wears sweaters even in the summer. When he walks in on her naked, it doesn't lead to an intimate encounter like it would in any other genre. It's played instead for laughs. Bridget and Sally also win over their love interests on the basis of their quirks. Even Daniel, who is a dog, is allured by Bridget's large granny panties and abysmal public speaking skills. Say what you want about rom-coms, but when they're good, they give women a chance to laugh at themselves. As Ephron put it, when you tell people you slipped on a banana peel, it's your laugh, so you become a hero rather than the victim of the joke. What these movies do is offer a fantasy that men will fall in love with your personality. It's not so much about selling the institution of marriage, as it is about taking women's desires seriously. While the vibe of a rom-com is important, there is something very integral to the success of a rom-com that holds all its components together. Something hopelessly undervalued by the film industry today. Something Denis Villeneuve inadvertently undermined in that interview. Writing. Good writing is the life force of a rom-com. So much so that world-building, chemistry, and idiosyncratic heroines cannot exist without it. Anyone But You can show us all the steamy, explicit shower scenes at once, but remember that the success of The Screwball is because it didn't have sex to fall back on. All it had was writing. And it set the benchmark for great rom-coms to come, from Annie Hall to When Harry Met Sally to Bridget, all of which are not only well-paced, structured, and thematically resonant, they're also chock full of wit. From the very first scene in When Harry Met Sally, a rapid witticism commences between the two, which is underscored by a furtive flirtation. We watch their love develop through an ongoing pattern, a topic being raised, the two debating it, and then through that, slowly revealing their core beliefs and values. This pattern repeats, but Harry and Sally evolve throughout, slowly breaking down their neuroses and walls until the only thing standing in the way of them is themselves. But this is folded into the jokes.
They don't make Sunday.
Why not?
Because of God.
I'm definitely coming down with something. Probably a 24-hour tumor they're going around.
And I'm gonna be 40!
When?
Someday!
Who is the dog?
You are.
I am. I am the dog. I am the dog.
Even in their final reconciliation, the best part of the scene isn't Harry's speech. The best part comes right after, when Harry immediately starts to nitpick the song that's playing.
What does this song mean? My whole life, I don't know what this song means. Does that mean that we should forget old acquaintances? It doesn't mean that if we happen to forget them, we should remember them, which is not possible because we already forgot them.
What this shows is that, despite their burgeoning romance, Harry and Sally's dynamic is the same. Bridget Jones is the film that makes me laugh most of all. Like I said, she and Daniel's courtship is predicated on a battle of innuendo delivered via email, and this is done through the very rapid-fire British humor of Helen Fielding. Like, the whole gag about Bridget's company publishing a book called Kafka's Motorbike is so wry, and culminates in the funniest scene of the film, where at one point they call back to Bridget describing the book as positively Vonnegut-esque by having Salman Rushdie say it.
This book is a searing vision of the wounds our century has inflicted on traditional masculinity. It's positively Vonnegut-esque.
Wounds our century has inflicted on traditional masculinity, positively Vonnegut-esque.
Immediately followed by Bridget clumsily delivering one of the worst introductory speeches in history.
And thank you for coming to the launch of one of the top 30 books of our time.
And these jokes come one after the other for the entirety of the film.
To be honest, darling, having children isn't all it's cracked up to be. Given my chance again, I'm not sure I'd have any. I think he was actually trying to flirt with Penny Husband's Bosworth, poor thing. She was very frightened. She's only just had her ovaries done.
Oh, Christ, not again.
Ugh.
What's his name? Happy birthday to you.
Unfortunately, Anyone But You relies much less on wit and a lot more on slapstick. But even the slapstick feels either too intense or just straight up alien. Like, this gag of the two of them feeling each other up to convince everyone that they're a couple makes no sense, because what couple would dig around in each other's assholes in front of their friends and family? So the writing of a rom-com needs to do two things. It needs to make us care about the love between two people, and it needs to make us laugh. And it's really obvious when these elements are neglected. This is when the formula doesn't work. There's a reason that when we give credit to a great rom-com, we usually attribute it to its screenwriter rather than its director. Nora Ephron, Richard Curtis, Helen Fielding, and Nancy Meyers are all first and foremost writers. In a 2022 article for The New Yorker, Rachel Syme writes about Nora Ephron's lost legacy and says, transforming Ephron into a cuddly heroine, a figure of mood and atmosphere, obscures the artist whose interest, above all, was in verbal precision. We often forget in our memory of Ephron, who passed away in 2012, that she began her career as a beat journalist, which grounded her later incisive observations on romance and love. But this is something that's been overlooked when we remember the romantic comedy, which always seems to happen with women's films. As Syme argues, Ephron's films are highly literary. Many of them are about reading and writing, and they suggest that language is at the heart of romance. There's this article from a couple years ago by a scholar named Megan Feeney, who really seems to hate rom-coms, and all the power to her. But from the way Feeney describes rom-coms, you'd think they were some sort of hydra that serious film-going culture must chop the head off of once every couple decades until it grows a new one and reinvents itself, much to our horror. It's kind of like the way I describe capitalism. She says, for almost a century now, the rom-com has been feeding on anxieties about social change and regurgitating a mandate on the couple, key to the reproduction of the genre, the social order, and the human species. Yes, I agree with her that rom-coms can and have had negative effects on the psyche of the viewing public. But I think it's important to ask why they continue to resonate with us. It can't just be blind nostalgia, as I've just outlined with some of the great rom-coms. So what is it that they're doing to us? Why were we so excited about Anyone But You? Well, a few things have happened in the past decade. Dating apps, Me Too, the pandemic, that have really shaken up the culture. Unpacking those events is enough material for another time, but essentially, I think we find ourselves in the midst of a fraught relationship with intimacy, which further distances us from romantic love. This isn't helped by the fact that the zeitgeist of the 2010s was particularly averse to romantic love, with Disney turning on its traditional love-centric storylines and focusing on independence, and like I said earlier, rom-coms cannibalizing themselves into self-aware meta-commentaries about the rom-com and why it's dumb and cliché. But since its inception, the rom-com hasn't so much fed on our anxieties as it has spoken to them. In their sociological study on romance and film, James Dowd and Nicole Pallotta write that more and more, we approach love in a clinical and pragmatic way. They say, we think of love, in other words, as a significant undertaking, an investment in our future well-being that must be approached carefully and rationally. And in doing so, we've lost our ties to romance. So right now, the impediment is loneliness and lost connection. We are failing to properly connect with each other on all avenues of life. We've become risk-averse, more separate than ever before. And I really do think that's why we're yearning for the rom-com, and even giving older ones a more favorable reading than we would have when they came out. We approach these movies not only as escapist fantasies for our wants and desires, but also blueprints for how we wish to live our lives, leaving things up to chance, being loved despite our flaws, taking risks on each other. As Dowd and Pallotta put it, the continued success of the Hollywood romantic film suggests that the dream of slipping one over on modernity is a deeply rooted, widely shared, and uncommonly resilient aspect of contemporary American culture. So Anyone But You is certainly the rom-com we need, although I'm not necessarily sure it's the one we deserve. Because again, romantic comedies aren't actually about watching two hot people blinking. The romantic comedy we deserve is one that makes us feel seen and understood, that allows us to dream, that doesn't laugh at us but laughs with us, that is adult in that its humor believes in our intelligence, that shows us romantic love in all forms, and most importantly of all, that makes us laugh. God knows we need it. And if you like uncomfortable laughter, check out my original series Taboo on Screen. It's about filmmakers who aren't afraid to show us the ugly, morally gray, and taboo aspects of humanity, and in doing so, attempt to crack open our worldviews, successfully or not. You can find Taboo on Screen exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that's creator-founded and creator-led, which means we get a ton of creative control over the videos we make. By subscribing to Nebula, you are directly supporting us, the creators, and you also get access to an insanely wide catalog of videos from the best of the best, like Princess Weeks, Be Kind Rewind, and Maggie May Fish. Right now, you can see my past videos ad-free on Nebula, and you can even watch Nebula videos offline with their app. Our homepage just got a major update to its interface, with videos categorized into news, culture, science, history, podcasts, and classes, which makes it easier for you to find both new and existing creators. Each category now has a homepage that operates a bit like a mini streaming service, so you can delve deeper into the stuff that you like, and maybe discover something new in the process. Maybe like my original series. Taboo on Screen was a series I had been wanting to make for a long time now, but I've never been able to put it on YouTube because of its strict community guidelines. Luckily, Nebula allows me to talk about more challenging subject matter without restrictions. In Taboo on Screen, we talk about whether we should get rid of schmeck scenes, the films of Todd Solondz, Brooke Shields and the controversy around Pretty Baby, and the wacky world of John Waters. If you're interested in watching Taboo, you can sign up using the link below, and you can support me directly and get Nebula for a 40% off annual plans, as little as over $2.50 a month. Then there's lifetime memberships, which cost $300 and last you forever. No tricks, no gimmicks, just you, me, and eternity, baby. So go to nebula.tv/broedeschanel or click the link in the description for 40% off right now. Special thank you to Louis Osta, Syed Hassan, Mel Pertwee, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunis, Brian Licata, Jenya, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.